Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am very happy to bring the conversation I had with Isaac Nakhimovsky. Isaac is Associate Professor of History and Humanities at Yale University. He was previously at the Faculty of History at the University of Cambridge. He has his PhD in Political Science from Harvard, and his research focuses on a variety of things, mostly on the history of political thought and on European debates about economic competition and international relations in the 17th through 19th centuries. He is the author of numerous books, including the most recent, The Holy Alliance, Liberalism and the Politics of Federation. That's what we talk about in the conversation. We start by talking about kind of a preface to much of what we discuss with in terms of history and political theory about how understanding current events in the world, especially globally and geopolitically, can really be helpful if you know history and if you understand historical events. So we talk about that. We talk about what is the Holy Alliance and this kind of ever-evolving question of what it is and what it isn't. We talk about the major players, major debates. We talk about this term that he uses in the book called Friend of Mankind and what that's about. We talk about various debates around the Holy Alliance. We talk about many characters in the book that he details, such as Harpe and Czartoryski. We also talk about Krug, Kant, and the history of religion. We talk about the League of Nations, and the Holy Alliance today, and many other topics. This was a really fun conversation, mostly for what we talked about in the beginning of why understanding history is super important for understanding things that happen today. Many times, something will happen in current events, and people say, well, how did we get here? Where does this originate from? Or how did this start? And usually you got to go back to history. Sometimes it's more recent history, sometimes it's much longer. And obviously, in trying to understand federated politics, understanding liberalism, it's important to understand where these things take place in and around the 19th century and many of the debates that were going on. This mostly takes place in Europe. In the back half of the book and in the conversation, we talk about how this kind of gets imported a bit into the United States more recently with Wilson and League of Nations, but a little bit into the founding of the U.S. as well. So it's interesting to kind of zoom in and zoom out of many of these topics. Isaac's wonderful. He's such a kind person. He was very generous with his time. He's obviously quite brilliant, has a really, really good handle on all of these topics, and it really was a lot of fun talking to him about this important history. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. I'm also on YouTube, so get over there, like, subscribe, share with your friends, all the wonderful things. It's much appreciated. And now I bring you Isaac Nakhimovsky. I am here with Isaac Nakhimovsky. I hope I got that right. Isaac, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm greatly looking forward to speaking with you.
Thanks so much for having me, and so am I.
Yeah, absolutely. You have written a really, really wonderful book. It's called The Holy Alliance, Liberalism and the Politics of Federation. This is out through the wonderful Princeton University Press. So we're going to talk all about the Holy Alliance. Before we do, could you tell listeners who you are professionally, academically, and what you're currently up to?
Sure. Thanks so much. So let's see. I teach at Yale. I teach history in the history department and the humanities program here. And I suppose I've bounced around a few times. I've crossed the border between history and political theory a number of times, and landed on the history side, but not completely. Still straddling it, I suppose. And that's because I really am interested in the sort of intersection between politics and ideas. A sort of flag I usually fly under is historian of political thought, sometimes intellectual historian will do, lots of flags. And I'm really interested in. I've worked for a long time now on understanding that sort of interface between ideas in politics. So not just to recover sort of ideas from the past, but really to understand the way in which they were employed, developed, put into action, as it were, by people confronting the situations they confronted. Or another way to put it, right, the ways in which they sort of equipped themselves or used the ideas they had available to them to make sense of the world that they were in and what it might have been and what it might become. And that I think one of the commitments is to sort of say that sort of perspective can give us some critical perspective on our own political
Mm.
judgments, the possibilities that we might be
Mm.
confronting. So that's an approach I've been following for some time in general. The first big project I sort of completed along those lines was to think about the idea of economic independence, of an autarkic state at the extreme,
Mm.
but economic independence more generally, and what the political theory of that might be. And that was resulted in a book about the idea of a closed commercial
Mm.
state, which was the name for this idea given to it by a German philosopher during the period of the French Revolution, Johann Gottlieb Fichte, and pops up as known as a sort of originator of nasty kinds of nationalism and fascism and so on, but also as the alternative to them that takes the form of securing national economic independence as opposed to global integration. So a sort
Mm.
of critical theorist of globalization, if you
Mm.
like. And that's where I was coming from. And then it was around 2016, and I thought, oh gosh, Brexit's just happened. People talk about economic independence more than they used to. I mean, I should say that original project was very much a financial crash
Mm.
2008 project. That was my way of making sense of that. And so it was 2016, and I thought, okay, Brexit's in the news. We're thinking about economic independence. We're thinking about the stability of national politics and in ways we're looking at the collapse possibly of these sorts of hopes that people put into federal or international systems as opposed to nation states. But I've already written a book about the nation state. From my perspective, I've sort of thought that one through. Granted, from a sort of odd starting point, but I tend to like odd starting points historically, and we can talk about maybe why I go for them. But so I thought, well, I better do the opposite
Mm.
then. Why did people put hopes in things like the European Union or the United Nations in the first place, which now look misplaced or dicey, to say the
Mm.
least? Why was a liberal internationalism something to go for, as opposed to now something that looks like, again, dicey or perhaps
Mm.
a big mistake if you follow those debates? And that sort of coincided in the sort of contingent way that I think projects like this tend to display, coincided with a bunch of other interests. Just to name one of the more random ones, I was reading War and Peace, rereading War and
Oh,
Peace because I
I
have a
I
newborn.
reread it last year. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a
Did
great
you?
reread.
So then you might remember that there's a interesting moment at the famously opaque and complex beginning of the
Hmm.
novel where there's a whole lot of characters you don't really know yet who's going to be important, and there's this character, the Abbe
Hmm.
Morio, who comes in and creates a little, there's a little bit of a scene at a party because he's pontificating about how to end European and destabilize, how to stabilize European politics, how Russia might have this world historical mission to be an emancipatory force for the world and solve the conflict between European states and empires once and for all. And who was that character based on? It was based on this crazy Italian guy, Scipione Piattoli, who I then looked up in my spare time and found to be an interesting character who was involved in this sort of story of the Holy Alliance. And so there were many sort of threads like that all sort of started to come together around this theme of the Holy Alliance, again, as a sort of unexpected, non-intuitive, but ultimately I would like to say sort of quite revealing historical starting point for thinking about these sorts of questions of
Mm.
international federations, liberal internationalism, federal politics more
Mm.
generally, alternatives to the nation state, and so on.
Mm. Yeah, I think it's super important. A few things there. First thing is interesting. I have a good friend of mine that loves Fichte, loves his philosophy. So I'm sure if he listens to this, I'm sure he'll have some
They
ideas.
exist. They're rare. Occasionally, Fichte Twitter gets really
Oh,
lit,
it
but
does. It does.
yeah,
um, and yeah, it's interesting. I part of the reason I like the approach was, it feels the book feels mostly historical, kind of peppered with a lot of political theory as well, which I find is more instructive of, I always, for me, I like to look backwards to see what we can learn from history that helps us about the present moment. Everyone always likes to think that the present moment is so unique and never been here before, we haven't done this, and really it's, if you understand history and you know how things are, there's a lot of things we can learn from that to push us, forward. And of course, again, as there is some uniqueness to each moment, there's but a lot of the times there's a lot of things you can learn from knowing history from the past. And I think that kind of question of sorts, what you were talking about, of how do we
yeah,
get here? How do we get this? Or what was the origins of that? Or how did, what were the debates going on here? Or what were the ideas to try and fix this at this point, at this juncture? Can really be, I think, instructive. And that's sort of kind of how I saw the book in a lot of ways.
yeah. The sort of the form of that approach that I was trying to follow, I think, in this book was it's a kind of question I think we are, possibly unfortunately
Hmm.
confronted with. What kind of situation are we in? What is our predicament exactly,
Hmm.
right? And this was again sort of presented in a particularly acute form in 2016, but recurringly so. Right? What are we facing? Right? Is this just another day in politics? Right? Just another walk in the jungle of international politics? Just another political struggle? Sometimes this kind of creature in the jungle comes out on top. Sometimes that kind of creature in the jungle comes out on top. Right? Just another day. Or is this a transformative moment? And that might mean something apocalyptic, right? Is this really the end of all the things that we value? Is this the beginning of a dark age of some kind? Or redemptive, right? Is this a transformative moment that has a real redemptive potential? And then if you think about it, you can really generalize that sort of question, right? If you are confronted with a revolution, well, is this an insurrection? Is a civil war? This is a reversion to a terrible past, or is this an opportunity for transformative change and progress? And I was really interested, the Holy Alliance, the way I approached it, approached this more general question of how to learn, how to think about the past in relation to present politics, was that this was a moment that has congealed since then into a set of enduring sort of ideological oppositions. And the Holy Alliance figures in some of those, some of which we remember, some of which we don't, some of which, interestingly, are remembered in other political cultures more than in the
Hmm.
Anglosphere, particularly any political culture that in which the Communist Manifesto, which is the most
Yeah.
famous invocation of the Holy Alliance, enduringly, any political culture in which that text has played a key role or remains a touchstone,
Mm.
refers to holy alliances and unholy
Mm.
alliances constantly. But even in ours, we see, even in very recent politics, people reach for the analogy. Still, it's not quite as live a wire as it used to be, but
Hmm.
it's there. But in any case, there are these congealed sort of stories. Um, and it's illuminating, I think, to unpack that uncertainty and to think about, how did people confront this moment? Was this the apocalypse? Was this redemptive? Or was this just another day in the jungle? And the reasons, and this is where this is a particular approach to telling history. It's focused on the way people, past actors, thought about what they were doing, or what was possible. Some of whom were able to exert a fair amount of sort of analytical precision on that, or were in contact with people who did and were availing themselves of that, of those conceptual resources. So how did those people make sense of that moment? What were the reasons? And those reasons turn out to not be unintelligible. They turn out not to be sort of very unfamiliar or from an other tradition. The Holy Alliance is often othered.
Mm.
They turn out to be very familiar, very
Mm.
prolific in some cases. perhaps uncomfortably familiar.
Well, this is, I mean, you're bringing up a good point there. This is why I don't like when people, somebody's party wins or somebody other politician wins in whichever, the United States, in France and in England, whatever. And people say it's the end of the republic, or it's the end. It's I don't like the kind of sensationalist kind of uh, I mean, obviously some things are serious. There's serious claims that one side may make. People may have disagreements, but it might be kind of like what you're saying, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it is. And this is where having an understanding of history and other political movements and how they work can really kind of help mm, anchor one to say, okay, let's think through this a little bit more um,
Yeah.
reasonably, constructively, rationally, instead of just terror. And I mean, I understand some of it, but I certainly think that it needs to be kind of approached a little bit more reasonably in many ways.
Yeah. So my strategy for that, I think this is one strategy, right? There are others, but the strategy I've followed here is to take a starting point that doesn't easily fit into those kind of more reflexive or more familiar stories. Are to be more precise about, right? They rely on a certain kind of historical analogy,
Mm,
right? If you think that we're facing particular kind of apocalypse, right, then oddly, this is something that's really interested me um, since it became so prominent in the last decade, right? Um, what is the analogy you reach for to show that,
mm,
in fact, this is an exceptional
mhm,
moment? And
mhm,
there's a sort of tension there between the analogy and the exception that you're claiming to give it sort of that moral force, right? So, is this another Munich? Is this another Vietnam? That sort of, or to reach for older ones, right? Is this the French Revolutionary Terror? Is this something awful like that? And when you really, dig into a moment like this and recover the whole range of perspectives, all the thinking that went into it. Those sorts of clear moral imperatives become more complex. And so, this is all really an exercise to try and see how do you think about a moment like this, not abstracting away from that complexity into these clear ideological, dueling of ideological views of apocalypse or redemption or
mm,
whatever,
yeah.
but really sort of see the complexity of a moment like this.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. Okay, so
Yeah.
what is the Holy Alliance? What is this? A lot of people, some people may know, but a lot of people would be like, I don't know what this is. What's a Holy Alliance? So, yeah, tell us what it is. You can maybe, I'll give you as much runway here as you want, but you can, you can tie it with our understanding of modern liberalism if you want at some point. But you say a bunch of things about what it is. There's the details of it, but you also talk about it as a constitutional act. You see it as used with federated politics. So yeah, kind of tell us the banner kind of elements of the Holy Alliance, but then a little bit more of the details about it and why it's important for understanding liberalism.
All right. Let me give that a go. But it's maybe rely on you to help me
Sure, sure.
bring in some of the threads that I'm going to drop unavoidably, because in a sense, that's the question of the whole book. And so it's a difficult one. One of the challenges, I think, of the book was to avoid it sort of kind of proliferating too much into just a survey of, oh, this guy said this,
Hmm.
and this gets that, the Holy Lands was that. And it's this other weird thing that the Holy Alliance was said to be. And that wasn't my goal here. I'm particularly was focused on how it could possibly have been the case, right, that some people saw this as a liberal, in fact, as one of them put it, right, the most liberal of all ideas. How
Mm,
could someone have even said that? That's the starting point. Again, to open up, to avoid starting with any strong assumptions, to start and to unpack that. And so the way I came to sort of approach this big question, what is the Holy Alliance, was to say, okay, there are a lot of questions like this in that period. What is the social question? What is the Jewish question? And those, what is the Holy Alliance? Is it redemptive? Is it a Is it the apocalypse? Is it just another empire? So, and I'll get into that. I know the actual historical circumstances are a little less familiar, so maybe I should start with
Sure.
those and then get into more
Yeah,
conceptual territory,
give
right?
us
So,
I guess
yeah,
the landscape of it. What's the
let's situate ourselves because if I'm not careful, one danger is to like not leave the runway, another is to just fly off into the clouds a little bit too quickly. So where are we, right? So there's been decades of systemic conflict, right? Starting with the French Revolutionary Wars, there's a French Revolution. There's invasions, French Revolutionary Wars. That's already following on what was perceived at the time to be decades of intensifying and metastasizing imperial conflict, most dangerously for many contemporaries between Britain and France. Those were the two great. Was a great imperial rivalry of the 18th century, and it seems to have exploded in catastrophic form, engulfed not just Europe, but these were starting to be wars that were impacted many other continents, even from the middle of the 18th century. Right, these are global wars fought from North America through South Asia and so on. So, decades of war, the French Revolution, obviously a very complicated process, but there's a general who ultimately seizes power, right? Napoleon. The result is not stabilization from many perspectives, right? But an even further extension of imperial conquest. And like others, sort of would-be conquerors of Europe, Napoleon goes and says, "Oh, maybe I should add to this project by invading Russia." And got as far as Moscow, Moscow burned, and then there was this famous catastrophic military collapse, retreat from Russia, and there's the Russian army marching, liberating Europe, marching from the east, and um, and that's the moment. So then the Russian army reaches Paris, and in a sense, to the remarkable thing that happens is that Moscow had just been burned. Paris is not burned. The Tsar stops. The Russian Emperor stops outside Paris and says, I'm a friend of the French. I'm here to establish constitutional government and to end these decades of conflict once and for all." Meets with the French representatives, the French Senate puts together a constitution. Everything's wonderful. He forgives. There's amnesty. There's forgiveness. There's all these things. Some people are annoyed. He spends all this time trying to reconcile the warring parties in France to bring back the king, but with something like a republican constitution, so on and so forth. Some people love this. Some people think he's the Messiah. Some people are annoyed because he's betraying this or that. But that's the role that he carved out for himself. It's a familiar role. We can talk about the history of that role. It's both its origins and its and its later history. But then, of course, Napoleon escapes from exile, comes back, interrupting the sort of complex diplomatic negotiations to come up with a settlement and all the messy sort of diplomacy that happens after systemic conflicts like this. And when he's defeated at Waterloo, the new occupation of Paris is not Russian led. It's the British and the Prussians who have defeated Napoleon at Waterloo, and the new peace takes on different form. Right? There's military occupation. France is divided up into zones. All that sort of stuff that we're familiar with again from later wars in Europe. There's the big question of war reparations. Again, not the only time this is going to come up. And the Tsar's and his sort of vision of reconciliation, his vision of his approach to this question that again is a recurring question: how do you take a victorious military alliance that wins a war against an aggressor and turn it into something that's not a military alliance imposing its will on the defeated, but something that can identify itself as a universal community, a community of nations? So his approach has been sidelined. The Holy Alliance is, in a sense, one way to get into it is it's a sort of strategy he follows to reclaim that role he he had claimed for himself. So what does he do? He gets his allies and the restored French king. He kind of buttonholes them. Again, there's a massive Russian army in Europe, so he has some. He has this claim to moral authority. He's also got some muscle behind him, and the powers in Europe really did depend on that muscle. The other continental European powers had been were not able to stand up on their own without Russian support. So it says you gotta sign this agreement I've drafted here, and then there's some interesting sort of subterfuge because they try to redefine it as he's doing it. But basically, his idea was get them to sign on to this agreement. And then, despite their, over their objections, or they claimed they had no idea this was going to happen, he then published this agreement and invited the rest of Europe to join it. What was the agreement? So it took the form of a diplomatic text, and it basically said, from now on, we're done with the bad imperial politics of the past. We're not going to fight as empires anymore. Instead, we are going to apply Christian moral principles to politics. What does that mean? The text goes on to say, well, it means we are all part of one Christian nation, divided into many parts, right? But we are all, there's the revolutionary idea, fraternité, brotherhood. So we're all members of this one nation, divided in many parts. It goes on to say, we're not sovereigns. We are, in fact, deputies of the true sovereign above, right? There's only the sovereignty of God, or famously then becomes a very important liberal sort of slogan. You can think of the sort of way in which the Constitution is discussed in our times, right? Nobody is above the Constitution. There are only officers fulfilling roles defined by it. So it's that kind of move, and then to say any state in any state that agrees with these principles may join the Holy Alliance. And there were some very interesting diplomatic attempts to sort of alter this, suppress this, including changing the text of it, which we can get into. But many of the famous sort of descriptions of the Holy Alliance as sublime mysticism and nonsense, and so on. I mean, these come from these the diplomatic backroom and the sort of cigar-filled, not that, the sort of the back room, the inner diplomatic debates. But then the Tsar pulled another one, right? He went back home and he published the treaty with a sort of manifesto. And it says Christmas now, 1815. And that's what, outside the sort of hidden world of diplomacy, that's what everybody in the world saw, was this manifesto proclaiming these principles. And there was a kind of enthusiasm to it that had, for example, initially greeted the news of the French Revolution, 1789. And many of the people who observed this, and not just, so this is particularly pronounced in the German lands, but it really spread particularly across the Protestant world. So from Germany, Scandinavia, Britain, and even New England, an interesting part of the story. This was seen as, a way to draw a line under the bad politics of the past, the imperial conflict, the slave trade, just all the bad things that people saw as being the root causes of this decades of conflict in the French Revolution. This was the answer to those, and so I was interested in trying to unpack, why could they see that? But that's that was the Holy Alliance that they perceived. So many of them treated this text as, and again, this is not my analogy. This is the views of people at the time. Right? This is something like the Declaration of Independence in the United States in 1776. Right? Initially, it's a diplomatic instrument of some kind, but it acquires this sort of real significance. Right? It describes a turning point. It describes a set of ideals around which we can organize future politics. Right? And so that's this idea. Right? What this really is, it's like a European version of the Declaration of Independence. It's setting out the sort of fundamental principles according to which new constitutional politics is going to emerge. For different people, that means different things. But they parse just as people read
Hmm.
the Declaration of Independence very closely and attribute expansive meanings to them too, right? So what does one Christian nation really mean, right? Does it mean, okay, the Holy Alliance means that every European state has to implement religious toleration? The only sovereign is God. Does that mean representative government, right? So on and so forth. And so that's the sort of idea. Why could they see this? Well, the big argument of the book is that the way that the Tsar performed this strategy, this act, the way he sort of constructed this treaty and published it, that was a well-known sort of script that was
Mm,
following a pattern that people recognized. It goes back; it has a history,
mm,
and so they could see this for that reason as following a sort of known procedure for how you introduce transformative change. Goes back to the Enlightenment,
mm,
so that's the sense in which this is a sort of Enlightenment project. The Czar was doing a version of that, and they could then read it as such. They knew how to sort of play their part.
mm,
The Czar had introduced it according to those lines. So that's the Holy Alliance as an idea, as it were.
mm,
That's how this particular strategy became connected with ideas of progress that we have come to call liberalism, or as this one fellow said, the most liberal of all ideas.
mhm,
But it's an important part of the story, and I really need to clarify it's not my purpose to say, so look, here's the Holy Alliance. We should do this.
mhm, mhm,
Um, it is an important part of the project to juxtapose that perspective with the outcome, right? With the fact that it became a brutally repressive sort of system of
mm,
politics. That's in some ways the more familiar part of the story. That within a few years, the Holy Alliance was being connected, and Russian influence on Europe was being connected with crackdowns on universities, with heavy-handed interventions to suppress movements for constitutional change, and not intervening where people were liberals in Europe wanted them to intervene, right, to support the cause of freedom,
mhm,
in particular, to liberate, as I said, and to emancipate the Greeks who were having their revolution. So how did something that had these Enlightenment roots that could register for so many people as progressive, as a route for liberal progress, and it became reactionary? How did this act that could be for again not only intelligible but familiar reasons become become something reactionary?
mm,
That's the central question. That's what the Holy Alliance, I think, really is for the book. Is that question?
mm. Yes, it's very well explained. I, of course, have 70,000 follow-up questions, but I
Go
guess there's a
for it.
few things. I'll try and streamline it here.
Mhm.
Why? Maybe we can introduce. I'll take two big topics here. Maybe I can introduce this phrase you use, which I thought was really interesting. This friend of mankind that you
Yeah.
introduced kind of somewhere in the book there. Um, what does that mean? What was how is this kind of like an antidote to the enemy of mankind? And it applied to education reform and opposition to slavery and enlightened civic culture and so the Tsar of Russia, if he's you know been dominant and he has an army and he gets all the way there, like why didn't he just burn it all down and like listen, I won, that's it, that's how. This feels like such a strange turn all of a sudden when you get to Paris. And was it why didn't he just like other empires have done, they just hey, listen, I'm gonna bust down the door, I'm gonna beat you up and then you're my subjects or whatever. Like what, or maybe he did it in other places, but what was it that there was like, okay, now I want to be a friend of mankind, and now we want to do all these things. What was, I guess, as best we can know, the motivation for that? Second part or second topic or category here is, um, I can re-ask this, but this idea of these have this the Holy Alliance and these documents have sort of been the foundation or set the kind of tone for what we look in federated republics or kind of modern liberalism and all these things which we come to like. But it sounds like there's a dark side of liberalism, obviously because of what we know afterwards, which would be very interesting to talk about there. And this piece of something that I continue to have disagreements about with some people a lot of people, especially nowadays, so I can kind of use a kind of current example, is people will say that liberal values, Western values, are really just Christian values. And if you really want to get to the essence of liberalism and Western values, right? Free speech, rule of law, that you have, good civic culture, all of these things, those are just really Christian. You need to have some form of Christianity because that's where it all comes from, anyways. And there's been plenty of, historians and other thinkers and other people and that have made this claim, this charge. And what my position on this is, I certainly don't disregard the impact Christianity has had on, Western civilization and all that. And out, in Eastern Europe as well. So certainly. But to say that it's endogenous to Western values, like Christianity is endogenous, like you can't separate the two outside of that. And we wouldn't have any of these good things we like of liberalism or a pluralistic liberal culture without, or, in a cosmopolitan way, without Christianity is, I think, to put it kindly, a bridge too far. I can say it in another way too, but I think that's a bridge too far. At least I don't think we can say that. So, yeah. So I can re-ask this question because I know it's like a kind of bigger topic. But yeah, tell us about this friend of mankind. What was the kind of motives for the Tsar of Russia? Why didn't he just keep barreling his way through? Why did he want to do all these things? Yeah, and these kind of motives for doing some of this stuff.
These are great questions, and I'll maybe just start by observing that that's what I was particularly these sort of bigger questions that you're opening up into. I mean, the sort of the the strategy here was to try and in a sense make a topic that is usually a topic for diplomatic history, right? What did this power broker say to that power broker when the real grown-ups are negotiating at the table, right? That's the sort of traditional um, form of story here. And of course, there's been a huge amount, this is building on a huge amount of scholarship that has really broadened that picture out, right? Really, there's a huge, very complex and interesting cultural context for all these things. It's not just the sort of men in the inner room
Hmm.
doing their big boy diplomacy, right? It's
Hmm.
it's the whole culture and so on around that. But I think what I wanted to add to that sort of bigger picture was this to show, and again to show through not just by me connecting it sort of arbitrarily, but really to show in the lives of particular participants in this moment, observers and participants in this moment, that the people really addressing these bigger questions, like for example the place of Christianity or the history of Christianity and the history of religion, its political significance, the connection between Christianity and liberalism, like those big questions and really sort of prominent and elaborate and systematic approaches to answering them were part of the question of the Holy Alliance. So, on the one hand, that makes the topic of the Holy Alliance this massive, very complex topic that's difficult to summarize. On the other hand, it gives a sort of theoretical precision, philosophical precision to the question of, well, what is this thing that would be absent if you just looked at these
Mm.
diplomatic, a narrower sort of picture of a diplomatic history. So I'll try and get to that question of the role of Christianity and religion. But maybe I see if I can get there without getting lost from the question of the friend of
Yeah.
mankind.
Yeah.
So again, part of the strategy here is to avoid the sort of the usual sort of more reflexive, sort of familiar ways of understanding moments like this, right? Um, where you would maybe resort to concepts that we hear a lot, right?
Hmm.
Hegemony being an important one, right? So what's happening here, right? Is this just replacing one hegemony, Napoleon's, with
Hmm.
another, Russian?
Hmm.
Um, or is this a qualitative change, right? Can we see a moral distinction between the two, right? That
Yeah.
was the evil empire, and now we are going to establish a new kind of order. If you want to have the legitimacy of that kind of distinction, you have to kind of have some sort of claim to substantiate it. Now, importantly, I do not with the sort of sources I'm working with here, the kind of story I'm trying to tell, the questions I'm asking are not questions, right? About, well, what was this emperor of Russia really thinking in his heart of
Right.
hearts? What was he really doing? That's not a question. Well, I mean, you're the thing. Leave that for the psychologists, perhaps. But also, it's not that, in a sense, I'm telling the history of projections,
Mm.
right? A lot of interesting people, I think, with interesting things to say about what they see. And many of them are sort of direct observers who, in one important case for me, right, were actually involved in educating him or were his hostage and then best friend and then foreign minister, to take two of the central characters of my book. So these are people with personal knowledge. It's also people like British abolitionists who, read, like what they read, go over, pray with him, and say, okay, we're on the same team here. Now let's get busy
Mm.
doing politics together with our shared goals. So it's people projecting. Do we learn from that a great deal about Russia and the Emperor Alexander? Maybe not, right? Did he really mean to have this sea change, or was he really actually just trying to extend Russian power?
Mm.
That's not the question that I'm trying to definitively answer here, but rather, I think is very revealing about the people who are seeing these things in this moment, because we're surrounded by claims like that still with a different object, right? Again, this is a very unfamiliar one, at least in current discourse, but it is a comparison that is therefore quite challenging, right? What are people going to say about the versions of this, from our own history, from more recent decades, right? What are people going to say about the United Nations and the way it was formed out of the Second World War? What are they already saying, but what will they say in 100 years? What will they say about the end of the Cold War,
Mm.
right? And the way in which politics changed in that moment and the way it was conceptualized.
Is
And
isn't there
yeah,
like a bit? It's something that irritates me a lot is people do this
mhm,
like kind of revisionist history. It's like, yeah, sure, like maybe we can pick on the United Nations now. We can pick on how the Cold War was ended now, or maybe we
mhm,
will in 25 years. But like that was the options on the table at the time, and it made sense, and it was fine when it was. Maybe I mean, can you do the same thing kind of here? It's like, look, in 18, whatever it was, like this is what made sense. This is yeah, sure we can sit here and critique it, till high heaven, and just say like, well, this and this and this and this, 200 years later, but like at the time, in context, right? Like,
yeah.
how does that kind of fit there?
Well, maybe the way I would put it is that the point of doing this kind of history, for me at least, is in the first instance to understand,
Yeah.
right? To explain.
Hmm.
And I'm not, I make moral judgments. I have plenty of them, believe me. But maybe too many. But that's that I'm not writing a history. I'm not going through all this trouble to kind of excavate, reconstruct this sort of complex history in order to say, well,
Right.
here's what we should do, or here's what they should have done, or they were right, but rather to sort of unpack it's a critical project.
Yeah.
It's a project to sort of to expose and sort of to expose and to try and show how you can do without some of the assumptions that maybe cloud our view of our own moment as much as they might cloud
Hmm.
our view right retrospectively, right? If the Cold War is just a very simple story, we won, they lost, for example, we're good, they're bad. Again, I'm not trying to sort of revise in the sense of saying, well, it's the other way around. I think I'm kind of worried about that as a sort of potential misreading of my book
Yeah.
that I
Yeah.
think will come out, right? Oh, the Holy Alliance was reactionary, but you're saying it's the opposite. It's freedom and liberal and so on. That's not the story
Hmm.
here. It's more instructive to see actually it's not so simple.
Hmm.
That in fact it was supposed to be liberal, but it was not.
Mm.
Um, so why not? That you can't even ask that question if it was just supposed to be reactionary from the beginning, or it just clearly
Mm.
was doomed, fated to be
Mm.
that. And I'm not just trying to flip that judgment on its head, right?
Mm.
To really inquire, look under the hood. What did all these observers think was actually what were the pieces? And I think we can learn from those.
Mm.
But in the spirit of trying to understand, in the first
Mm.
instance, to explain.
You you you
Yeah,
you're
go
you're
ahead.
talking about in terms of the friend of mankind. You mentioned these three
Yeah,
debates, which will probably dovetail us into the religious
sure.
question. You talk about
Yeah.
Russia's military success, the new European legal order, and then the role that religion plays. And we can start introducing characters there later, and the influence of Kant and his kind of shadow over things philosophically, which is really interesting. But when we talk about this friend of mankind, it does seem like there's these different kind of elements of what that is. How did those kind of play together, I guess?
Great. So that's enough throat clearing. So what's a friend of mankind? Well, it's one of these sort of older languages that it takes a lot of work to try and learn how to speak and listen to again. But then I think it has some analytical purchase. So this is an 18th century term. It's got all these literary and other sort of aspects. But what I'm interested in is that it's a term for a role, a political role that it's actually quite difficult to identify. Right? It's this role of the sort of an agent of a state, a leader, who's able to sort of take individual responsibility for collective security. Right? So if you think of the liberator nation, right? Everyone has been overrun by the aggressor, and we are not just replacing that with another hegemony, but we are replacing it with something qualitatively different. We are liberating, we're creating a new order based on principles of justice of some kind that probably takes some federal form, so on. That's the idea of the friend of mankind. So importantly, it's a sort of moral character in the sense of what are the sort of what's the moral character behind this kind of behavior. But a big part of the story is it's not just that. We spend too much time dwelling exclusively on that. If we don't appreciate that, when people talk about the friend of mankind in the 18th century and so on, they're talking about the sort of the material capacities as well. What kind of economy does a nation have to have? Politics, sort of what other capacities does it have to have in order to perform this role? What is that role? How is it specified? That gets into sort of some very interesting legal questions, and then ultimately moral and religious ones. Right? Does this presuppose a sort of what kind of agency does this presuppose? So the term for that was current in the 18th century. It pops up in this period. Alexander's the friend of mankind. It's in War and Peace. It's in all these places. Right? Is a way of capturing that role. It's defined in opposition to this other term a much older term actually, that you also brought up, the enemy of mankind, which has been written about in interesting ways. Sort of epithet for the devil, for pirates, people, for enemies of the common good, right? Enemies of all established order, say, right? So Napoleon is being castigated in this way, but so are before that, right? So are perhaps Britain or France, or perhaps even both of them. They're two governments, they're two empires locked into this struggle, which is having such disastrous effects, for systemic effects, right? That's the politics of an enemy of mankind, the enemy of humanity. And the friend of humanity is a deliverer from that. And both Britain and France have their claims to be that deliverer. There's even this very important strand of thinking, well, if only Britain and France could reconcile, they jointly could solve many of the problems that we would now maybe call feudalism, right? Or we could also think of as the politics of enemies of mankind, these former conquerors who still preside, preside over this militarized politics over all of Europe. Jointly, they could overcome that, but they didn't, right? And so, what do frustrated reformers do when they can't reform their own government, or when their own empire seems, unmovable? They look for outside help, or let's say you try to have a revolution in your own country and it's quashed, perhaps without outside help, or your war of national liberation is crushed. What do? You look for outside help. You look for a sort of this kind of role. So who can play this role of liberating without just being another conqueror? And there's a long history, which I go through, right, of how Russia is perceived in the 18th century. Again, this is why the Holy Alliance could be seen as emancipatory initially so broadly, because it was, that image of Russia was constructed, and that Russia was going to save Europe. It was going to save Europe from the Anglo-British disaster, which many people in the 18th century feared was going to destroy Europe. It's going to destroy modern civilization, return to the Dark Ages. here's this weird place, right? It's both very backward, but has these enlightened rulers, or so they present themselves, or they have a stake in presenting themselves. So is that an opportunity, right? Can we create some sort of politics with those parameters that will solve European politics from the outside, right? The backwardness is perhaps an opportunity because it hasn't gone through the same developmental trajectory that has produced Britain and France in their imperial wars, right? So there's still opportunity, right, to pursue a different developmental path. The fact that it has this enlightenment, rulers who are both autocratic but committed to sort of presenting themselves in Europe as cultivated and sort of exemplars of European values, can that be sort of turned into a politics that will make Russia into this kind of agent, a friend of mankind? Britain and France failed, doesn't seem to be working. Can we do it from Russia? These are the ideas that come back with great force when the Russian army is marching across Europe, chasing Napoleon, and then the spectacle in Paris. And there was very self-conscious performance because the Tsar had been educated to do this. So that's the sort of friend of mankind idea. I go on to say, I think it's a very sort of prominent. Well, it has a long history. Woodrow Wilson, who's the next sort of who's the next person to consciously perform this role, to march into Paris to a hero's welcome and say, this is not just another day in the jungle, right? This is a transformative moment. We've now made the world safe for democracy. Very self-conscious, still using this old archaic language at the end of the First World War, and trying to play that role again with a different sort of set of material parameters, right? So instead of saying, well, how can we use Russian backwardness, its dependence on Western capital, this sort of cultural politics of the fact that Russian emperors want to present themselves as enlightened. So can we set up a sort of system where they're dependent on our approval? We're supplying them with the capital and the migrants to develop, but not in the ways that European empires have developed, and that will enable and empower them to play this friend of mankind role. Instead of that, right, it's in 1917, 1919, it's a different set of questions, right? How are we going to use American finance and so on to change Europe and change the rest of the world system as well. So that's the friend of mankind idea and its role in the book. And then the debates that you allude to are, and that's sort of that's the sort of strategy of the book again, is to keep unpacking the complexity of this question: what is the Holy Alliance? By examining these moments where reasons for thinking one thing or the other come into view, where they rely on quite systemic thinking, whether it's because someone has read a lot of the Enlightenment history writing about Russia, or someone is a professor of logic and metaphysics who was Emmanuel Kant's direct successor, and so on. They're using, or someone is an English radical English reformer who's thought quite a bit about legal change and how to bring it about, like Jeremy Bentham, who had this spectacular career in Russia. We can talk about it if you want. Right? These are moments, these are debates that unfold where you can see how these big questions that you brought up, the sort of questions you brought up, are implicated in understanding the politics in the moment for these people. And again, I'm not sort of arbitrarily making these connections, but they're there. They're there in these biographies, and in these, they're being deployed by these historical actors. So these are the sorts of questions that come up. First of all, what about this backwardness question, right? And does this really mean that you can have a politics, you can somehow construct a politics where Russia can intervene, and essentially, if you think about it sort of functionally, right, play the role of what we would think of as a federal government, right, maintaining the conditions for liberal politics within each of the member sort of components. Can we turn the Russian Empire into something, playing that role from the outside, where it sort of solves the security questions, and also maybe creates the sort of overall stability that's required for a stable form of representative politics to take shape. So the question of backwardness, right? So then again, the Russian army is marching across Europe, and there's this one illustrative debate of that kind is actually in America, and it's about sort of analyzing this military history and saying, well, does this represent an agent, a friend of mankind who can perform this role or not? Then the question is, and again, to understand the Holy Alliance, you have to see that this is following the Tsar is consciously performing a role that follows an expected pattern of how legal change happens, how his transformative change can be brought about, right? First, you have a military alliance that defeats the aggressor. Then you have a diplomatic settlement, but then you have legislating a new order. So how's that going to happen? What's that going to do? Does a new world order, right, one that isn't just another empire, another hegemony, does that require this kind of agent? Or in fact, giving the agent that kind of legitimacy actually undermines the very concept, right? If you claim that there's one empire that sort of reserves to itself the right to intervene in other countries in order to maintain the stability of the system, have you simply opened the door back into the old kind of power politics, right? These are familiar questions. Just look at who belongs in the Security Council of the United Nations for an illustration of how that's not a dead question. And so that's the sort of second momentary debate, right? Here's Paris under occupation, the Russian army there. Is this now an opportunity to legislate a new kind of politics? What would that look like? And Emmanuel Kant was a very important figure in this story because he had produced this, what looked like a blueprint for this kind of moment. And again, in 1919, 1945, in the 1990s, in this Cold War moment, and Kant's text about this, and Perpetual Peace, has resurfaced again and again. And this was, in a sense, the first big time when it resurfaced. And people said, this is the time when we introduce what Kant described as perpetual peace. But Kant didn't seem to say, right, that you get this empire that's going to sort of do this central work. Or did he, right? This is the question that is being debated. Does this kind of liberal order presuppose that kind of agent? If it presupposes it, is it self-undermining? And then finally, the big question that you introduced earlier, the question about religion. So part of the story, which I omitted earlier, right, is that in part of the Tsar's performance involved hanging around with this kind of religious figure from Livonia, from the Baltics, German Baltics, who it was a new kind of religious sentiment that goes under various names. And again, one of the challenges this book, very broadly, a challenge of this book was to try and bring together topics that are usually treated very separately, right? The history of slavery and abolition in the Atlantic world usually has nothing to do with what was happening, how the Atlantic economy, its effects on Europe was being perceived and fought out in Central Europe and in Russia. Question of representative government and the sort of material conditions for constitutionalism, very different from the diplomacy around something like the Holy Alliance. Likewise, the sort of religious histories are not only separated from those sorts of questions, but they are treated very differently in different contexts, right? So there's lots you can read about the rise of evangelical Christianity, its importance for the abolitionist movement, for example. In Britain and the US. You can read a lot about pietism in Central Europe. And then you go east, and suddenly we're talking about mysticism. Always struck me as a very orientalizing kind of way of talking about it. So from that perspective, right, the Tsar is hanging out with this bizarre mystic who really sort of, she prays with people in this sort of non-conventional way. It's very detached from established forms of religious authority, really sort of focused on inward spirituality and sort of direct communion and all that sort of stuff. And the Tsar is totally into this, and they're praying together, and people think, my gosh, it seems like she's actually written this thing. It's in her kind of language. This is all her. And the real history is, I think, much more interesting than that, right? Because in a sense, the whole question about the relationship between Christianity and liberalism is one that's being debated and, in some sense, constructed
Hmm.
in this very moment.
Hmm.
Does a liberal politics rely on some kind of religious moral basis or not? Well, that's something that liberals then and ever since did not agree about. Right? Do we have to have moral commitments that are sort of transcendent or not? And any account of liberal, any attempt to construct a kind of liberal history or canon of liberalism that sort of takes a position on questions like that, I think is trying to do right. It's trying to give answers
Hmm.
in a way that may serve a particular purpose, but is obscuring.
Hmm.
Right? It's a step away from this kind of complexity that I'm trying to recover. So, in fact, there were in our liberals who say, well, no, it's actually about demystifying, getting rid of those things. And there's others that say, well, no, it won't stand up without it. And that's why Jeremy Bentham is part of the story, and utilitarians are part of the story, but so are evangelicals. And the relations between them are not so straightforward.
Hmm.
So, interestingly, that sort of religion, again, it's easily associated. It became associated with kind of repressive forms of nationalism, particularly in Germany. Um, but anyway, anyone who does religious history in this country too, it's the same people. There are some of them come out of southern Germany, some of them migrate to Pennsylvania, some of them migrate to southern Russia. Right?
Hmm.
They're not fundamentally different, which is why, again, these British abolitionists, British evangelicals, or even New England Unitarians, right? They can look at this and say, we recognize this. So there's one real fissure here between people who think there really should be a religious, or needs to be a religious basis to liberal politics, and those who say that actually undermines it. And then there's again another further fissure, right? This kind of spirituality which sees God acting through us in immediate ways, right? So for this mystic I'm referring to, I should say her name, uh, Krugner, Krugner, right? For her, right, the Tsar is the Messiah, Napoleon's the devil.
Mm.
It's a second coming. God has personally anointed Alexander. She's the prophet of this, and it's as simple as that, right? Europe has been punished for its sins, and now it's being redeemed. But there are other kinds of Christians who don't go in for that kind of view of providence, or particularly if they are reader of Kant, or even if they're not, but they're a different kind of Christian who doesn't think that we can have that kind of knowledge, right? Then you need a different kind of view. You maybe need a different way of understanding even potential for redemption, and more abstract, right? More to do with what the species is capable in the full history of the species, that sort of thing. Um, and and there's this kind of funny dance, right, between those two kinds of, of views of Christianity, and that's part of American history just as much as it's part of the history of the Holy Alliance. And so again, not unfamiliar.
Mm.
But to get a little bit to the cast of characters, I mean, the way it's partly constructed is around the biographies of people who moved through this whole history,
Mm.
right? So in particular, I'm following two characters. Um, One is Polish, one is Swiss,
Hmm.
and their lifespan is a particularly critical part of the story, right? Because they're sort of they're coming of age in the 1780s. They are in this kind of moment of sort of where things seem to be going the way that politics is being enlightened. How is it being enlightened, right? There's been this whole stream of prominent Enlightenment figures who go to Russia. Denis Diderot, Voltaire doesn't actually go. Most of them don't actually brave go in there, but some of them did, and
Hmm.
Diderot kind of had no choice. We went right. How can we do this right? And it's about removing obstacles to enlightenment. It's
Mm.
about removing material and political obstacles to development.
Mm.
Right? How do you change the path of economic development to make it possible for people for moral change,
Mm.
right? Or how do you legislate in order to make this possible? And then there's this different view, right? And the circle that where this view is most prominent is a very famous figure circle in the history of liberalism. It's Germaine de Stael, Benjamin Constant. These are people who figure very prominently in history's liberalism to this day,
Mm.
for whom liberalism, the history of moral progress has to, and political progress, the history of liberalism presupposes, it's best seen through the history of moral progress that Christianity underwent or made possible. And they debate this, right? So this is again, the fact that Alexander is hanging out with von Krudner, is that a sign that he's straying from this Enlightenment script, or is he enacting it in a new way? Right? There are different views of this depending on these debates about the history of Christianity and liberalism, essentially. Right? From one perspective, right, Christianity is a sort of very distinctly Protestant view, obviously. Right? Christianity has over time rationalized itself, purified itself. It takes different forms depending on what the sort of people at the time can sort of understand in their culture of the moment. But gradually things get to the point where these fundamental moral truths become revealed in their sort of rational purity, and this is part of that process. This is part of an important stage in that sort of story. For others, right, this is turning your back on enlightenment or mystifying it in ways that are just going to produce more problems than it solves. So again, it's part of American history in a big way, right? Should there be a constitutional amendment to, add God to the Constitution? That was a big question in the 19th century, and it's a similar sort of question here. But so what happens with the Holy Alliance, right? The Tsar sides very much on the religious side, the Christian side, rather, I should say. And my point is that's thrilling not just for reactionaries. In fact, people against liberalism were also against his religious language. And some of the most perceptive critics who figure in the story of the Holy Alliance were Catholic, because they said, you think that you've created a new form of Christianity that transcends all these sectarian divisions. It's going to overcome nationalism. It's going to overcome class conflict and so on. Because again, one Christian nation, right? We all pray together. We don't belong to this church versus that church, and all these conflicts. And for a Catholic, right, that's not the real deal. That's a sort of attenuated kind of pretend religiosity that's not going to really give you the moral agency that you need to transform politics. That comes from Rome, right? That's an institutional form. From the other side, that's producing another obstacle to the process of enlightenment, process of enabling people to enlighten themselves rather than enabling them. So these, again, familiar debates, if you really think about the history of liberalism, if you think about American history, if you think about European history and all these different national contexts. But my point is, it's part of the Holy Alliance, right? So that's what's being the Tsar uses this language. All these evangelicals in Britain and New England sign on to it. They undertake all sorts of political actions on the basis of it, right? Including, this is an episode I can't resist sort of flagging, right? Including efforts to intervene in Haitian politics, right? To defend Haiti, which had famously undergone the first, anti-colonial revolution in the New World, to really create the first Black state. There's this threat, and Napoleon then invaded it. There's a threat again that'll be invaded again. Is this new politics of the Russian friend of mankind is actually going to transform the Atlantic economy and the slave trade and defend Haiti from its former colonial oppressors, right? That's one way in which this goes. But from the other side, right, this is betrayal, and the reason why for its reactionary outcome. And so again, gradually widening my back to these two characters I've following. The Swiss and Czartoryski.
Tell us about these two, because they're in the book so much, and the influence of creating a federal state in Germany comes into play here, which I thought was super interesting. Obviously, we get that in 1871, I guess, right? Is the unification of Germany. So it's interesting.
That's one story.
right. Yeah. So tell us about these two figures. The Harpe was really interesting. So
sure, let me try and get into that. Which is so that they're interesting for many of the reasons, including they're involved in all the things you're trying to mention, all the histories you're trying to mention. But one interesting aspect about them that help make them so prominent for the story is their sort of their generational position, right? So they're what I meant to start up by saying was, right, they're kind of in this moment in the 1780s. They're connected to all these Enlightenment figures. Czartoryski is a son of a very prominent Polish family. Poland famously had absolutely disastrous fate at the end of the 18th century, divided and conquered off the map. But he was part of the sort of, the Polish politics trying to avert that, Polish reformers. What do you do again? So he goes to Paris, meets all the leading intellectuals in Paris. How can we sort of apply your ideas, but also maybe enlist French support to prevent this carving up this old imperial story? And he goes to London, does the same with all the major figures in England. That's where he meets Bentham. He's a teenager. But also, many other important figures. Marquis de Condorcet being a very important one in Paris. Thomas Jefferson. All these sorts of people were hanging out in these capitals of enlightenment. And so that's the 1780s, right? Then he goes back. He's part of this amazing moment in Poland where they actually produce a constitution that seems like cutting edge, right? Okay, the Americans did okay in 1787. Maybe the French did even better, according to some initially, right, in the French Revolution. And no, but the Polish constitution, now that seems to be the best of all of them. John Adams doesn't disagree necessarily, right? Lots of people think this. But it's quashed, right? They're wiped off the map. He ends up in a hostage in St. Petersburg, and then the future emperor's best friend. And when Alexander, the Russian emperor, does take power, he ends up very close to the seat of power. And what is his mission, right? So he's tried national liberation. He's tried reforming the state from within, but now he's going to dedicate himself to this politics we've been talking about, this distinctive politics of trying to create constitutions from the outside. It's a sort of prolific form of politics, I think. There are lots of historical examples. German history is, in a sense, one, just sort of be a little bit loose about it, right? Yeah, so sure, Bismarck fights these wars. There's an imperial consolidation, kind of the opposite of what many Germans wanted, right? One side won and imposed its version of unity. But then, how did Germany get its present constitution, right? Well, there was a war, a military occupation. Some German intellectuals, also part of my story, as kind of, descendants, as it were, of the characters in this book, right, come and help the American military authorities impose this constitution, which famously does not have a moment of, ratification or anything like that. Just basic laws there. So that's the sort of model that took place in 1815 in Switzerland. So that's my other. So this is what the Polish character Czartoryski is trying to do. La Harpe is the other one. So he was, before I get into it, I just wanted to finally finish that thought that I never quite get out, which is, these are people from the 1780s. They're trying to do this Enlightenment politics that everyone is doing. It fails. Then Czartoryski finds himself back in power in Russia. So he tries to do it, not this time from Paris and London, but from Russia. And he enlists all the people that he met in London and Paris to try and help him. So they're involved in this together. That fails too in the beginning of the 19th century, during the Napoleonic Wars. And then it's this crazy moment, right? The Russian army's in Paris. The Tsar is the hero of the day in both Paris and London. Tries again. It doesn't work that time either. Instead, what happens is the Holy Alliance is kind of locked out of it, Czartoryski. But then things go really badly, and it becomes very reactionary in the 1820s. And that's the moment when liberalism is defined in opposition to the Holy Alliance and opposition to its reactionary politics. All of these familiar ideological constructions here, right? Democracy versus autarky, liberalism versus reaction, you name it, right? All these sorts of contrasts appear and stick. And the interesting thing about these characters from the 1780s, they're sort of dinosaurs in a way. They say, yes, this was a disaster. We're liberals. They're liberals just like everyone else. But this is a disaster. But don't confuse what happened with what was supposed to be. They're still committed to that politics of the 1780s. So by the 1820s, right, talking about federal constitutions, talking about this liberator nation coming in and giving a constitution where you couldn't get it sort of from the ground up for popular sovereignty. That's reaction, right? That's a prison. That's against national liberation. That's against liberalism. And they say, not so fast, right? That was the 1780s. And this whole nation state thing, it may not work so well either, certainly not for Polish, right? It's going to get suppressed, and it does. So they're dinosaurs, I think, often of that lifespan, right? They're coming from the 1780s, 1789 is their big moment. And then it's decades later, it's the 20s of the next century, and they're surrounded by reaction, and they say, well, there was something to hold on to there, and the sort of reaction to the reaction that we're now undergoing, this nation state fixation, isn't going to go that well either. So think about the difference in time, right, between 1989 and the hopes of that moment and the politics of that moment and the 2020s. It's the same span of time. So I think about that in terms of who these characters were, why I follow them a lot. So there's the Polish case, how to save your nation, which has been buried by imperial conquest, and then as a sort of vassal state of this empire, can that be turned into one of these liberating moments? And he fails. There is a national uprising in 1830. He's dragged into it, and becomes the president of the short-lived restored Polish state, and it's exiled. And becomes sort of a leader of the Polish opposition. But he still defends this model of politics in the 1780s, right? That's what I'm interested in. The Swiss guy, so he's interesting because Swiss politics, again, people usually tell the story, they tell European history from the perspective of the great powers, right? Okay, here's what the Austrian statesmen and the British statesmen, here's what was happening at quarters of power and the great powers. And it's interesting to look at these people who come from outside of that, but are close to it and are observing it very closely. And sometimes the people from smaller places that really are going to suffer the consequences of what happens in the big places, they're more acute observers, see more from their perspective. So the Swiss fellow is one of them. So Switzerland, before the French Revolution, was not the sort of equal federation of cantons that came to be. He came from a subject territory, so he was from the French-speaking part of Switzerland, the Pays de Vaud, which was a sort of subject territory. It was part of the empire of the city of Bern. Big power in the Swiss context, right? Military power and juggernaut in Switzerland. These are its colonial subjects, as he saw it. So how is he going to change that, right, from the outside, given the impossibility of changing from the inside? He tries lots of things. He's like one of these political exiles who goes and tries to get other countries to invade his country to fix his politics. He's doing that. He does it actually remarkably successfully. But anyway, his first career, he goes out, he thinks about going and fighting the American Revolution, and then he gets this great gig instead, which is to serve at the court of the Russian Empress, Catherine the Great, and ultimately sort of maneuvers himself into being in charge of the education of her grandson, her preferred, although not actual successor, and that is the Russian Emperor Alexander. There's the small matter of the murder of his father, which we can glide over. And so he coached, educated, taught. In a sense, what was his role? He wanted to teach the future emperor of Russia. This was his job, essentially, right? Teach his student, the future emperor of Russia, to perform this kind of role of the friend of mankind, to be a practitioner of enlightened politics who can use Russian power in that way. Of course, he's not without his own particular interests, right? He's hoping that this will be the tool for liberating Switzerland, right? Liberating his part of Switzerland from the oligarchy that has dominated it over it, but also more generally, right? To fix your own domestic politics part of the story, right? Without fixing the broader picture. So it's going to fix Germany, it's going to fix all these things. And he's training the person to do that. Then, the French Revolution happens. He successfully convinces the French to liberate his part of Switzerland. He becomes part of the new Swiss revolutionary government. Then the moment when he sort of loses power is the moment that his former student regains power in Russia. So he re-involves himself. And long story short, he is successful in practicing this kind of politics in the sense that in 1815, it's through his connection with the emperor, he plays a very important role in the diplomatic negotiations at the Congress of Vienna, and does prevent both Switzerland having happened to Switzerland, what happened to Poland, being partitioned among great powers. He prevents a restoration of the old regime, right, which again would reduce his corner of Switzerland to feudalism, right, and domination by a small oligarchy. And instead, a new constitution, which, while not as liberal as he would have liked, he did see as a stepping stone to the establishment of a stable kind of liberal politics. And so, in a sense, the big story, or part of the big story, right, is how can that be generalized? All these Germans, for example, are looking at this. Okay, you could do that for Switzerland,
Right.
right? There are other examples of that kind of politics. Let's get it for Germany.
Mm.
Why not, right? And so that's another big part of the story,
Mm.
is the sort of hope that this will be Germany's future, in a sense, to save it from the history of conflict that then produced 1871 and everything after it. Instead, to create a real German federation.
Mm.
And that that there was a German federation that was created in 1815, but it was seen as vulnerable to the rivalry, the old kind of politics between Austria and Prussia, and Russian power was seen as a way to maybe avert
Mm.
that trajectory, create a real federal state um, through all these parts.
Let me
Yeah.
add a third character here, and going back
Yeah.
to the religious piece, right? Because I think
Mhm.
obviously these two gentlemen were instrumental. I mean, La Harpe was very interesting in terms of he sounds like a like he knows how to talk his way in and out of situations. I respect it. I respect it. But he obviously was super influential, and I agree. I like the kind of looking at it from kind of a lesser known figure, or big power, and it's really interesting because you can get that kind of acute perspective. But you talk about towards the end of the book, am I saying Krug? Am I saying this right?
Krug,
Krug,
yeah.
yeah. Interesting. So we can do a little philosophy here if you want, but he has this idea of progress with the religious undercurrent, Christian undercurrent, but he's seen a history of religion after how Kant saw a history of religion. And so you talk about different um, players here. You mentioned Fichte in the beginning, there's Schelling, there's obviously Kant is huge. You get Hegel kind of afterwards. So this is like the apex of German idealism, right? What is the system completed? That kind of thing in a practical way, right? Have they figured out the absolute yet? All that good stuff. I guess how did Krug see moral progress intertwined with kind of the way in which Kant was seeing this history of religion, and where we get kind of liberal ideas, which, as you mentioned, we still were talking about that in the 90s after the Cold War. So yeah, talk about like this impact, or maybe kind of Krug's commentary or analysis on I mean, really German idealism, essentially. I mean, Kant, but even the bench, if you will, of Fichte and Schelling as well.
Sure. With pleasure. I'll squeeze in one last appendix to our exchange about the ARP, which
Mhm.
is that you're right. So he's a good talker, but part of what I show, it's not just he's an interesting character, sure, but it's the connections that he opens up that are so interesting to me. Right? How does he learn these rhetorical strategies that he actually
Mm,
deploys?
mm,
He learns them because he's hanging out in the leading salons in
mm,
Paris, talking to all these really sophisticated practitioners of these sorts of rhetoric, and it's through the connections he makes in those spaces that he tries to enlist so many supporters for this project, including to North America. Right, there's
yeah,
uh,
yeah.
this sort of gambit with the administration of Thomas Jefferson
Mhm,
that is part of the story. That's through him, and the reason I wanted to go through so much trouble um, to unpack those gambits. Again, did that alliance come to anything? Not really, right? But it was an interesting possibility, and what it really does is to again guard against this tendency, which was sort of appeared in the 1820s and remains a tendency, right? Which is to say, well, the Holy Alliance is Eastern mystical reactionary,
mm,
right? And it's fundamentally different from Western values and from Western politics that are based on them. And I'm going to show, well, they really come, they're composed of the same ingredients. These are actors who are traveling in networks that cross that divide. That divide is in this period a construct
mm,
that emerges. And so that makes the sort of question of what makes liberalism work or not more of a pressing one, if you like,
mm,
and not easily dismissed by saying, well, we do it this way. We are this, and
mm,
they are that,
mm,
right?
mm,
So Krug is also part of that story.
mm,
So Krug is, his at one point his title was professor of logic and metaphysics at the University of Königsberg, which was Kant's Immanuel Kant's title. Krug was Kant's immediate successor after Kant's death. He didn't, as we would say in academia, right? Maybe the quality of the appointment did not match what had come before exactly. But Professor Krug took over from Professor Kant, and why did he? Well, this was a government appointment to some degree, and the reason was that this seemed like a safe exponent of the leading philosophy of the day of Kant's philosophy. Safe in comparison to these radicals down at the University of Jena, who had all these crazy ideas, right? That they were really the true spirit of Kant's philosophy, and that it had to do with detaching systematic reason from the sort of from the whatever rationality of the day might be around them. So they seem like the real radicals. They're a little bit dangerous. This is Victor Schelling and others. And Krug seems, like I said, a right Kantian, was a left Kantian, who, he's not interested in Kant's metaphysics. He's interested in his practical philosophy, and expounds it and applies it in a way that seems to sort of, while it sort of creates a standard for contemporary politics, but it's connected to it. It's reachable in its terms, right? If that makes sense. And so, one of the little jokes I kind of sort of half joke that I allow myself is to say, well, I think Professor Krug would have been kind of at home in many a philosophy department from the 1970s onward in another neo-Kantian age, where a certain flavor of Kantianism was dominant in philosophy departments more generally. And so, a lot of the strategies that emerged in that period, post Cold War neo-Kantianism, are present. They were, it's not the first rodeo for for Kantianism, and Krug did a lot of the moves, right? He did a lot of the moves already, and so that's what I try to go into. But except perhaps a little bit more explicitly in some areas, right? So in some areas it's really quite explicit, like when he's talking about reasonableness. It's so Rawlsian, or Rawls is so Krugian.
Mm.
And this is why Professor Hegel is really devastating critic. But so he's got this ideal of here's a rational standard of justice, and it's really we're approximating it. We haven't achieved it, but we're approximating it. That right? So and it's a global justice, right? So that move has already been made, right? And all those moves were made again in the 70s onward. Krug already did them, except instead of the U.S. and NATO and so on, it was the Holy Alliance. That was the most liberal of all ideas, the sort of approximation of global justice for Krug. So that's a sense in which it's really quite explicit, but or it's really quite direct. But there are other areas where Krug brings out more aspects of that strategy, maybe that are obvious, right? In the history of religion,
Yeah.
the part of this Kantian picture, this Kantian strand of liberalism, which isn't just Kantian; it's a broader Protestant phenomenon, but that's a particular sort of version of a very distinctive, powerful, and sort of articulated version of a broader Protestant phenomenon. But the religious side is important, right? The way to understand moral as opposed to political process is a question for the history of religion and not for the history of law. So that's this bigger question, right? That's again, we're sort of, I want to say we're in this bigger family of very Protestant sorts of arguments. And not all of them are religious, though, because again, there are accounts of progress that are more materially driven, that have to do with the history of the division of labor, the history of law, and the history of culture, and so on, which are not so directly derived from this, maybe indirectly. But in this case, right, it's the history of Christianity that's going to tell you how moral progress happened. So, from this kind of Kantian perspective, politics, or the way that legal order emerges does not presuppose morality, particularly, right? Kant famously says, right, get these devils to clash enough times, and eventually they'll figure out, oh, we should have a legal system that makes politics non-lethal. So do that enough time, run that simulation enough times, you'll get legality, but not morality, right? So how does that happen? Well, that's a question. Again, that's what I was alluding to earlier with more generic Protestant terms, right? It's this unfolding. Different religious communities try to, instantiate and make real in their social relations these fundamental truths, and the history of the sort of approximation of those ideals appears in the history of those communities, right? And so, the Christianity of late 18th century Protestant Germany represents progress along that axis from, say, these religious communities of the distant past that were so sort of consumed, say, by their fear of God that they could only understand morality in terms of sacrifice and so on. Now we have this religious progress. We understand these sort of universal ideals, and the history of moral progress is a history of approximating those. And Krug is important because he's still very commonly cited, although I'm not sure how often read, but cited, yes, because he wrote what he claimed and what everyone still says is the first history of liberalism.
Mm.
It's published in 1823. And it's funny because there's so many histories of liberalism, so many books about liberalism that still kind of do the same moves, versions of the moves that Krug, again, was already kind of inaugurating in 1823. So where does the history of liberalism start? Well, it doesn't start in the aftermath of the French Revolution with these political moves, and how does this term start to appear in this kind of politics, and it's used as as a derogatory term, and it gets claimed, and all this sort of stuff. That's how liberalism turns into an ism. So someone who was liberal could espouse something called liberalism. No, the liberalism is the history of thought, starting with the ancient Greeks. Right, Socrates was the first liberal, and produces a canon that is still the canon. Right, on that basis, telling the history of liberal ideas, their struggle against the powers of the day, religious and political, and the way in which gradually this sort of purification of liberal ideas unfolds over this history.
What?
And it's both a political history and it's a religious history, right? So that emergence of liberal ideas in the religious sphere is part of what makes the Holy Alliance so liberal, because there it is. It says there's no sovereign but God.
But why do it that way? Was that just the time?
Yeah.
Why not make the turn for secularism here? Why not secular? Was it just
Yeah.
we
No,
got
I
we
appreciate that. That's your question. Yeah.
yeah we have to have people coalesce together. Religion is the best lubricant for that. Blah blah
Yeah.
blah blah blah. That's what we know, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
Why didn't somebody push for? Look, this stuff is fine, but let's have a secular version of doing this where we can still have moral progress. I mean, explicitly stated that way, and we don't need this religious history to tie us with moral progress. Why wasn't that the move, you think?
100%. So what I would say is that that was a live question. It was debated, and why did the people on the side of it that did go for this
Yeah.
for view again, which is different from the the version that Krugner and others are going for, right? It's related but different. It's, this guy's really the Messiah. This is the second coming. This is a different flavor, but they're related.
Yeah.
So why go for it? Well, let's so part of what I'm trying to say in the book is that that's central to the question of liberalism. It's a question that actually it's an Enlightenment question too. I mean, we have this picture that the Enlightenment was secular and atheist, and then there was a religious backlash, but it's not so simple at all.
Yeah.
So even in the high, in the 1750s, this question and the way all these English and French writers are trying to say, well, how can we save Europe from Russia? Well, they then have to ask this question, right? How does progress happen? Is it material and and legal and doesn't secular and doesn't require religion? In fact, depends on liberating from religious authority, or does it rely on it? Right? How does progress happen? What's the relationship between the material dimension of progress, right? Economic development, political change, and the moral progress. Which comes first? Which is dependent on the other, right? What's the relationship between them? Do you change laws first, and then moral change comes about, right? That's one template that we're familiar with, right?
Right.
Attempts
Right.
to say, okay, just legislate this and the culture will catch up and then maybe there's a reaction, right? Or do you have to sort of create a groundswell? You have to create moral change to start. And then once the culture has changed, the laws will follow, right? Um, and well, look, I mean, consider the history of civil rights in this country, for example, right?
Sure.
And what do you do when one of the strategies doesn't work? Then there's the other side, as it were, has grist for its mill. And so similarly, these are debates all through the 18th century. They figure, particularly with the question of Russia, like what should we, what can we do if we intervene in Russia, right? Should we reinforce the church? Should we
Mm.
undermine priests' authority in order to turn Russia into a friend of mankind? But then if if it's 1815, right? Well, what's happened?
Mm-hmm.
What did the French Revolution do? It did try to eliminate religious authority. And for many people, that didn't work. Now, the standard story, right, is that there's a religious reaction. Um, but it's important to see that within liberalism, this was not there was not a consensus, and there were these liberals, Benjamin Constant and Germaine de Stael, are sort of very prominent exponents of this position, right? That's what, in a sense, that's why the French Revolution failed. Put it really too crudely, right? It failed because it did not have this kind of
Mm.
religious underpinning,
Mm.
and so it needs it. And they go to Germany and they hang out with all these German philosophers, and they say this is the ticket, and we can sort of find this happening in this awakening, right? In this religious awakening, in this Protestant culture, in this Protestant spirituality. That's what we need a version of, right? So it's actually the Reformation in this view that's that's sort of the liberating moment, and we can unfold this history of religion. So in a sense, detaching liberty. So here's the other motive for it, right? The French Revolution was a huge conflict, and it seems to have lost, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you continue to tie your ideal of liberty to this failed political cause, Napoleon has taken over. He seems to be the Antichrist. He's just been defeated by all the powers of Europe. If you tie your cause of liberty to that, aren't you going to get suppressed, right? So can you just, and in any case, it's so contentious. It's such a political, um, it's such a live wire, isn't it? And then here's this recurring kind of temptation. Well, let's detach the value from the history of France. Let's detach it from political history. Let's detach it from politics. Let's construct this grand narrative and construct this sort of transcendent history of our values, which are bigger than any political side in this ideological conflict, and can somehow unite us. Right. This is a move that, again, there's this kind of creation of these consensuses, the liberal consensus of the post-war, the reinvention, if you like, in the Anglosphere of liberalism after the First World War. Right, all our values are under threat. How do we protect them? How do we protect them from totalitarianism, from all these bad things? We construct this kind of grand narrative and this set of transcendent values that have a history that is not the history of a particular state or a particular
Mm.
political.
Yeah.
That's why
Yeah.
the temptation, right, to start with Socrates and not with the history of the French Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
And the history goes from Socrates to the Reformation. And it's both a political history and a religious history, because it's both the history of political emancipation and moral progress. It's both political progress and moral progress. So Alexander is both the successor in this view, right, to political liberalism, the story of the overcoming of feudalism,
Mm.
and that all these people who would never have occurred to someone to consider liberal. John Locke, who's he? He's a radical Whig politician. No, he's an epitome of liberalism, and it's the Emperor of Russia who's the sort of the heir to his values and to his ideals. That's Krug. That's Krug's move. Got to it sort of before a lot of other people. And with moral progress, this is the heir to Martin Luther. This is the heir to Constantine, Martin Luther, all of the great reformers of the church who are creating religious liberty. Alexander is the successor to them. So it's not really about him, right? It's about this big history. It's all this big history. He's just the kind of
Mm-hmm.
he's expressing it. He's
Yeah.
the messenger for this big history of moral progress. And So that's Krug's version of Kantianism, how he
Mm.
applies it. And he says, right, so liberalism started with Socrates. We still have this genre, apparently, right? Plato to NATO. So liberalism started with Socrates
Right,
and
right.
ends with the Holy Alliance, the most liberal of all ideas.
Yeah,
But that's where the Jena people, right, the the left Kantians, kind of
yeah.
have its number, right? Because say, look, he's kind of given up the whole point of this game, right?
Mhm,
Which is
mhm,
to sort of um, have a perspective from which you can talk about reason in
mm,
a way that's not reducible to
mhm,
the empirical sources of this or that
mm,
moment. Um, and so Hegel gets to the point where he says, look, there's only really two moves that this kind of Kantianism,
yeah,
Proofs Kantianism, can make. They can either say, here's the transcendent ideal,
mhm,
and here's the thing that realizes it,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Here's the ideal of an ethical community. Here's my Holy Alliance, or here's my NATO. Here's my liberal constitution. It realizes those ideals of justice.
yeah.
And then it can go to the other pole and say, well, that's a transcendent ideal. So nothing can ever really achieve it. It's always going to be approximation. And for Hegel, that's sterile, right?
Yeah.
That's just going to oscillate between these two poles. It's not really going to it's not going to give you any sort of deeper understanding of the processes for
Mhm.
holding on to an idea of progress. So that's the story, in a sense, Krug says is the most liberal of all ideas. Lots of other Protestants like him do, from Boston, Massachusetts, all
Mhm.
the way through Leipzig, where Krug was, and so on. And then they say, well, the idea, we weren't ready for this idea. Next time.
I
And, the Kantians of the 20th century is that's the sort of critical perspective I would like to
mm,
open up, is that the Kantians of the 20th century were another chapter in that story,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
What's global justice? It
yeah.
faces its critics, and it's attached. If you look under the hood, it's attached to a similar kind of Protestantism
Yep, 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 yep.
in this country, and so on.
Well, yeah, I mean, man, I have, more thoughts, I guess, than I
Yeah.
guess questions or answers about that. So I'll have to chew on them more. But it is one of those things where um, it doesn't it doesn't as a current day moderate liberal, it does not make me feel great about liberalism. I'll put it that way. So,
It's
uh,
not meant to be a feel good.
yeah, it's not a feel good story,
It's
right?
meant to be kind of unsettling, but
Yeah.
again, in a way that maybe I'm a little weird, but
Mhm.
I find in a way a little bit potentially reassuring, right? Because it's not obvious
Mm.
what I'm trying to say, right? It's neither this kind of liberalism is not definitely the answer, but nor is the opposite of it, as it
Of
were,
course. Yeah. Yeah.
definitely the answer. And
Yeah.
so what that means is that there are possibilities which
Mm.
these easier stories, maybe more comfortable stories from one
Mhm.
century or the other, might obscure, right? If you're certain that we're replaying this moment or that moment in the
Mm.
past. I mean, again, you're kind of practicing the kind of politics that, the best term, as Karl Marx says, right? World historical necromancy. You're trying to
Mhm.
dress up as something in the past,
Right.
and that's
Right.
not really going to address the
Right.
moment.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So this is a criticism aimed as a criticism of all versions of that,
Mhm.
and that's unsettling. That prevents you appealing to liberalism
Mhm.
as an easy answer. But I want to
Yeah.
show how that answer emerged and wasn't, as you put it earlier yourself, right? It wasn't unintelligible, right? There were
Yeah.
reasons
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
constructing it this way, and the fact that it didn't work, there were real reasons, right? It
Mhm.
depended. There were political, economic, as well as religious and moral reasons why it didn't work in that version. But we
Mhm.
can see the problems, and then we
Yes.
can see that we have different versions of those problems. To be sure,
Mhm.
they're different,
Mhm.
right? The
Mhm.
world economy is different
Mhm.
in the 2020s,
Mhm.
let alone the mid 20th century, than it was in 1815. But
Mm.
at a level of abstraction, you can see that those problems structurally are enduring, and
Yeah.
that some of these more familiar responses do not address those problems.
Yes.
But that means
Yes.
that if we stop looking at the problem through, is liberalism doomed, or can it be saved? Is it going to be saved by the independent nation state, by some sort of federal system like the European Union? Can one or the other be propagated across post-colonial landscapes? So that's the world, Middle East or elsewhere. That's not the way to approach it. You have to
Yeah.
approach it
Yeah.
through these more
I,
complex problems, and to see why these more complex conglomerations of ideas like the Holy Alliance, which connects us, connects a political strategy, federal politics of a certain kind, with a narrative of progress that comes called liberalism, right? That connection happened. Why did it happen? Not reading back, as it were, from the ideology to the strategy.
I totally agree. I think one of the things that we do at our peril is to prop up systems or ideas as infallible or as things that, liberalism is, good in a lot of ways, but there's also challenges with it. There are things you have to take a critical approach. I feel the same way about democracy, right? Democracy also has, it's not a perfect system. And people treat it like it's, the 11th commandment or something. It's like, listen, like, you could shoot for that. Maybe it's the best out of all of them, or maybe it is, I don't know. But like, you still have to say, like, how can we critique these things? So, I think that's obviously, super important. Isaac, this is so much fun. I really, really enjoyed this. I enjoy the connections that you're able to make. Kind of the critical kind of, lens that you have. How you're able to navigate through all these things. It's the time goes quickly. So I wish I could talk to you for another 2 or 3 hours about so many other things. But
no, we could get to chapter 2.
Yeah, right. But this is a good excuse for people to get your book, which is great. So big thanks for coming on the podcast. I was very delighted to have you.
Thank you so much. This was a blast, and I really appreciate your insights into the book.
Yeah, for sure.